Quality, comfort, and grip at an affordable price. Whether it's our standard, pro, or elite socks, there's an option for everyone. Try a pair for yourself now at puregripsocks.com.
If you regularly play on artificial grass for safety, durability, and especially warranty reasons, it's a very good idea to invest in a pair of AG-specific football boots. But how come some AG stud patterns look like this versus others that look like this? What's the difference and which one should you go for? Well, we're actually going to start in the modern era of AG-specific stud patterns, which is basically the last 10 to 12 years or so. This is a 2014 Nike Magista Obra. I'm sure you recognize this design right away. However, it's a pair with the AG Pro stud pattern. A stud pattern that when compared to the FG layout is very, very different, not only in the fact that there are far more studs underneath the foot, but the stud length itself is significantly shorter. Where in the very early days of Nike's AG Pro specific stud patterns, while the stud design itself kind of remains the same as what we have now, in that the stud is hollowed out through the middle, allowing for a little bit of flex on the very tip, you'll notice that the stud length, as well as the general layout of a bunch of small short studs covering the bottom of your foot, makes this very much tailored for artificial grass only, in that if you were to wear this on firm natural grass, not that you wouldn't have any traction, but certainly the traction would be less than ideal. Where the same can be said about the Adidas AG alternative from in and around the same time, the 2014 Predator Instinct with the AG layout not only features significantly more studs than the standard FG model, but as you can see, the stud length itself is very, very short, which is great for use on artificial grass, but probably not so good if you wanted to use it on a natural grass playing surface. And then there was the introduction of FG AG boots, this being the 2015 Adidas X 15.1, which, as you can see, features a stud pattern that looks very familiar to the FG layouts that we see today from the three stripes. However, according to Adidas at the time, you were safe and free to use this on firm natural grass or artificial grass playing surfaces. Which from a warranty perspective is great, because under normal circumstances, if you wear an FG boot on artificial grass and they break prematurely, technically any brand could refuse your warranty claim because you're using the boots on a playing surface they were not intended for. Adidas was giving you the green light, however, to wear these on artificial grass, so that part was covered. However, there is something to be said about the general safety and how well this is actually suited for use on artificial grass, in the sense that, let's be real, this is just an FG stud pattern that they were saying you could use on artificial grass as well. A classification of stud pattern that we still see to this day, I have as an example the Nike Phantom 6 High Academy, a second tier takedown model with what Nike calls an FG MG stud pattern. But as you can see, side by side with the Elite model that just has the standard FG stud pattern, there is no difference. However, the classification changes. In other words, according to Nike's very broken logic, if you wear this $270 FG boot on artificial grass and the boots break, you won't have a warranty. However, if you wear these $95 takedown models and they break, you'll be covered. And also, according to that logic, these would be unsafe for use on artificial grass, while these are perfectly fine. Tell me how that makes any sense. Which brings us to the main topic of today's video, and that is, amongst the variety of different AG stud patterns out there, which one is going to be best suited to you? Where I'd argue that AG stud patterns are currently split into two different categories: true AG and then kind of a hybrid setup. Where if you exclusively play on artificial grass and have no intention whatsoever of ever having these boots touch a natural grass playing surface, something like the AG stud pattern on these Mizuno Morelia Neo 4 Beta Elites would be more or less ideal, and kind of relate back to those early AG stud patterns that I showed you from 2014, in that the stud length itself is about half of what you would find from a normal FG stud pattern, and you also have tons and tons of studs covering the bottom of the foot to evenly distribute pressure. Where specifically for use on artificial grass, this is better for comfort, it's better for durability, it's better for the long-term structural integrity of the sole plate, and I'd also personally argue that it's going to be safer, not in the sense that it provides the best traction, but because it provides the right amount of traction. Your foot is never going to get stuck into the ground, where if you were to get knocked the wrong way or push off a little bit too hard in a slightly awkward position, you'd be putting yourself typically at a higher risk of injury, knees, ankles, and hips being the main culprits there. However, something like this is going to give you great traction on an artificial grass playing surface while still managing to keep you safe. However, if you're somebody that regularly plays on artificial grass, but also make your way onto natural grass pitches as well and only want to buy one pair of football boots, FG-AG in other words, something like this AG layout on the Skechers SK-X2 Elite might be ideal for you. Where, let's be real, from a stud layout and even length perspective, this really doesn't differ that much from an FG stud pattern with all conical studs. However, it's that conical stud shape that's going to keep you relatively safe on an artificial grass playing surface, in that it's not going to cling to the ground itself. It's going to allow that freedom to twist and pivot and hopefully reduce your potential risk of injury. Of course, in the case of this specific layout, the stud length is relatively aggressive for an AG stud pattern, meaning that if you're playing on artificial grass that maybe is on the older side and maybe doesn't have the depth to it, these might be a little bit too long, and why you might want to consider something with shorter studs. But if you want to get away with using one pair of football boots on artificial and natural grass, something like this is fantastic. But let's also not ignore reality here, because you're probably looking at what is technically an AG stud pattern here on the SK-X2, and then as an example, I have a pair of New Balance 442 V2 Elites, an FG stud pattern, but take a look at the stud positioning and length along with the shape side by side with these Skechers boots, and let's be real again, what's really the difference here? Potentially some added thickness to the plastic sole plate on this AG specific pair, usually a little bit of an extended lip around the toe box and forefoot area for the sake of enhanced durability, but in all reality, the main difference is that if these football boots break while being used on artificial grass, Skechers should replace them for you if it happened in an unreasonable amount of time, whereas if you wear an FG boot and they happen to break on artificial grass, again, technically your warranty could be refused. Sounds a little ridiculous, I know, but it's a completely unregulated system, and the reason why it's so important for you as the consumer to do your research and potentially spend a little bit of extra money on a true AG layout, not just for the sake of comfort as well as overall performance, but also for the sake of potentially reducing your risk of injury, and perhaps even more importantly, protecting your investment. Because if you go and spend $250+ on a pair of FG football boots that break after a couple sessions on artificial grass, and you don't have the option of getting a free replacement pair, that's just not cool. Long story short, the fact that these are all considered AG stud patterns is not only confusing, it's a little bit ridiculous. But unfortunately, it's the reality of what AG football boots have become. In other words, do your research and choose wisely, because looks can be deceiving.